They questioned her readiness until a captured sniper said, "She's the one we were warned about." The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. Around her, 23 male recruits moved through their exercises with practiced ease, their movements sharp and confident. She could feel their sideways glances, hear their whispered doubts carried on the desert wind. At 22, Sarah was the only woman in the elite sniper training program at Fort Benning, and every day felt like a test she had to pass twice as hard as anyone else. "Martinez, you're up?" called Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Sarah approached the firing line, her boots crunching against the gravel. The target sat 800 meters away, a barely visible silhouette against the rocky outcropping. She dropped to her stomach, feeling the familiar comfort of the rifle against her shoulder. Behind her, she heard Private Johnson whisper to his buddy, "Watch her shake. Women don't have the nerve for this kind of pressure." The comment stung, but Sarah had learned to channel that pain into focus. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow as she peered through the scope. The world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and the distant target. The shot rang out across the desert, echoing off the surrounding hills. Through the scope, she watched the target spin as her bullet found its mark, dead center. A moment of silence followed before Rodriguez's voice boomed across the range. "Perfect shot, Martinez. Johnson, you're next. Try to match that." Sarah stood and dusted off her uniform, catching the surprised looks from her fellow trainees. She had grown used to exceeding expectations, but it never got easier. Her journey to this moment had been filled with obstacles that her male counterparts never had to face. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had learned to shoot from her grandfather, a World War II veteran who treated her no differently than he would have treated a grandson. "You've got steady hands and a calm mind," he used to tell her as they practiced in the fields behind his house. "That's what makes a good shooter, not what's between your legs." Those words had carried her through high school, where she dominated the rifle team, and through college ROTC, where she first encountered the military's complicated relationship with women in combat roles. The lunch break brought little relief from the scrutiny. Sarah sat alone at a picnic table, reviewing her field manual while eating an MRE. The other trainees clustered together, their conversations peppered with crude jokes and casual dismissals of her abilities. She had learned not to engage, knowing that every reaction would be seen as proof that women were too emotional for combat. "Hey, Martinez," called out Corporal Thompson, one of the more vocal skeptics in the group. "My girlfriend back home wants to know if you paint your nails before you go shooting." The group erupted in laughter, but Sarah simply turned the page of her manual and continued reading. She had bigger battles to fight than playground taunts. The afternoon brought urban warfare training, where recruits had to navigate through a mock city while identifying and eliminating threats. Sarah moved through the concrete maze with calculated precision, her movements fluid and purposeful. She had studied the layout for hours the night before, memorizing every corner and potential hiding spot. While others relied on aggression and speed, she used intelligence and patience. As she rounded a corner, she spotted movement in a third-story window 4 blocks away. Her scope revealed a training instructor positioned as a hostile sniper. The shot was nearly impossible, requiring her to account for wind, distance, and the slight elevation change. She steadied herself against a concrete barrier, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The instructor's training vest registered the hit, and over the radio came his grudging acknowledgement. "Target eliminated." "Good eyes, Martinez." That evening, as the other recruits gathered around the television in the common area, Sarah found herself studying satellite images of various conflict zones. She wasn't just preparing for tests. She was preparing for war. The political climate was tense, with several international hotspots threatening to boil over. She knew that graduation from this program would likely mean deployment to one of these dangerous regions. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the news about tensions in Eastern Europe. Please tell me you're not going there." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm exactly where I need to be." It wasn't entirely honest, but it was necessary. Her family had supported her decision to join the military, but they still worried about their daughter entering a world traditionally dominated by men. The weeks that followed tested every aspect of Sarah's abilities. She excelled in marksmanship, often achieving scores that surpassed veteran instructors. Her tactical knowledge impressed even the most skeptical officers. But it was her mental resilience that truly set her apart. While other recruits cracked under pressure or let emotions cloud their judgment, Sarah remained steady as stone. During a particularly grueling night exercise, several recruits had to be pulled from the field due to exhaustion or panic attacks. Sarah not only completed the course but did so while helping a struggling teammate navigate through a simulated minefield. Her actions that night earned her the grudging respect of Sergeant Rodriguez, who pulled her aside afterward. "You know they're watching you extra carefully," he said, his voice lacking its usual harsh edge. "Every mistake you make gets magnified. Every success gets questioned. It's not fair, but that's the reality." Sarah nodded, having already figured this out for herself. "The question is," Rodriguez continued, "can you handle that pressure when bullets are real and lives are on the line?" "There's only one way to find out, Sergeant," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. She had come too far to doubt herself now. The program was nearly complete, and she could see the finish line ahead. But she also sensed that her real test was still to come, somewhere in a hostile land where her abilities would be measured not by instructors with stopwatches, but by enemies with real bullets and deadly intent. As she walked back to the barracks that night, Sarah looked up at the star-filled sky and thought about her grandfather's words. Steady hands and a calm mind. She had both, and soon the world would see exactly what she could do with them. 6 months after graduation, Sarah found herself crouched in the ruins of what had once been a school in eastern Ukraine. The conflict had escalated faster than anyone predicted, and NATO forces had been deployed to assist the Ukrainian military in pushing back Russian advances. The building around her bore the scars of weeks of fighting, bullet holes in the walls, shattered glass crunching underfoot, and the acrid smell of smoke that never seemed to fade. Her spotter, Corporal Mike Chen, lay beside her adjusting his binoculars. They had been paired together 3 weeks ago, and despite his initial skepticism about working with a female sniper, Chen had quickly learned to trust Sarah's judgment. She had already logged 15 confirmed kills, more than most snipers achieved in their entire careers. "Movement. 2 o'clock, about 600 meters, Chen whispered, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Sarah shifted her rifle slightly, peering through the scope at a partially collapsed apartment building. Through a gap in the rubble, she could see figures moving methodically through the structure, Russian soldiers likely setting up an observation post to monitor the main supply route below. "I count 4, maybe 5 targets," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible. "They're trying to establish overwatch on the convoy route." The supply convoys were critical to the Ukrainian defense of this sector. If Russian spotters could call in artillery strikes on those vehicles, it would severely compromise the entire operation. Sarah's radio crackled with the voice of Captain Williams, her commanding officer. "Phantom 2, we have a convoy moving through your sector in 30 minutes. Road needs to be clear." The message was clear. Eliminate the threat before friendly forces entered the kill zone. "Copy that, Control. We'll handle it," Sarah responded, her mind already calculating wind speed, distance, and trajectory. The first target was the easiest. A soldier partially exposed while setting up what looked like radio equipment. Sarah adjusted for the crosswind and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and through the scope she watched the target drop. The remaining soldiers immediately took cover, but Sarah had already spotted their positions. Years of training had taught her to read the battlefield like a book. She knew where they would move, where they would try to hide. Over the next 10 minutes, she systematically eliminated each threat, her shots precise and deadly. By the time the convoy rumbled past 30 minutes later, the road was safe. That afternoon, Sarah and Chen moved to a new position in the industrial district. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Russian colonel coordinating artillery strikes, was operating from a factory complex about a kilometer away. The shot would be challenging, requiring her to fire through a narrow gap between 2 buildings while accounting for the heat shimmer rising from the factory's smokestacks. As they set up their hide, Chen expressed doubts about the mission. "This is crazy, Martinez. That's nearly a mile shot through industrial haze. Even the best snipers in the world would think twice about this one." Sarah checked her equipment methodically, running through her pre-shot routine. She had made similar shots during training, but never under combat conditions with an enemy actively hunting for her position. Sometimes crazy is what the situation requires. she replied, settling into her firing position. Through her scope, she could barely make out the target building. The colonel was supposed to appear at a specific window during his scheduled communication checks with Moscow. Sarah would have maybe a 3-second window to take the shot. Hours passed as they waited in the freezing cold, their breath fogging in the air despite their efforts to remain still. Sarah's muscles ached from maintaining her position, but she refused to move. Professional snipers learned to endure discomfort that would break civilian minds. Finally, movement appeared in the target window. Sarah recognized the uniform insignia through her scope. This was definitely their man. The shot was unlike anything she had ever attempted. The bullet would have to travel over hostile territory, through varying wind conditions, and arrive precisely when the target was most vulnerable. Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow to an almost meditative rhythm. The world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and that distant window. She squeezed the trigger. 18 seconds later, Chen's binoculars confirmed the hit. "Target down!" Holy shit, Martinez, that was incredible. But their celebration was short-lived. Within minutes, the area around them erupted with incoming artillery fire. The colonel's security detail had triangulated their position and called in fire support. Sarah and Chen grabbed their gear and began a fighting retreat through the industrial complex. Russian search teams were already moving to cut off their escape routes. Sarah found herself in her first close-quarters firefight, using her sidearm to engage enemies at ranges where her sniper rifle was useless. Her training kicked in automatically. Movement, communication, and precise shooting even under extreme stress. She and Chen fought their way through 3 blocks of urban terrain before reaching the extraction point. Back at the forward operating base, word of Sarah's long-range elimination had already spread through the unit. The other snipers looked at her with a mixture of respect and amazement. Even the most experienced veterans admitted they wouldn't have attempted such a shot under those conditions. Captain Williams pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Martinez, I've been doing this for 15 years, and that was one of the most impressive pieces of shooting I've ever seen," he said. "But I need you to understand something. The Russians know about you now. They're calling you the Ghost because you seem to appear and disappear without a trace. That makes you valuable to us, but it also makes you a primary target for them." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Being effective on the battlefield was only half the challenge. Staying alive long enough to continue being effective was the other half. She knew that enemy snipers were probably already being briefed about her tactics and capabilities. The next phase of this war would be even more dangerous. That night, as she cleaned her rifle in the dim light of the bunker, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from that training ground in Georgia. The doubts and whispers of her fellow trainees seemed like ancient history now. She had proven herself in the most decisive way possible, through actions under fire. But she also knew that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The war was escalating, and both sides were bringing in their best shooters. Soon she would face opponents every bit as skilled and determined as herself. 2 weeks later, Sarah crouched in the bell tower of a damaged church, her rifle trained on the street below. Intelligence had identified this location as a key transit point for Russian supply convoys moving through the city. Her mission was simple in concept but deadly in execution: disrupt enemy logistics while avoiding the counter-sniper teams that were now actively hunting her. The morning fog provided excellent concealment as Sarah settled into her position. Through her scope, she could see the intersection where 3 major roads converged. Her spotter position was empty today. Chen had been reassigned after taking shrapnel in their last engagement. Working alone increased the risk, but it also eliminated variables. Sarah trusted her own instincts completely. The first convoy appeared just after sunrise, a line of military trucks escorted by armored vehicles. Sarah identified her priority targets: the lead vehicle's driver and the communications specialist in the third truck. Taking out the driver would create chaos and block the road. Eliminating the radio operator would prevent them from calling for immediate support. Her first shot dropped the lead driver, causing his vehicle to veer into a concrete barrier. The convoy immediately stopped as soldiers poured out to establish a defensive perimeter. Sarah's second shot found the communications specialist before he could reach his radio. Within minutes, the intersection was in complete disarray, with soldiers scrambling for cover while officers tried to restore order. But Sarah had made a critical error. In her focus on the convoy, she hadn't noticed the Russian sniper team that had been tracking her for the past hour. The distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle echoed through the church, as a bullet shattered the stone inches from her head. Sarah rolled away from the window as more shots peppered her position. She was trapped. Through the damaged walls of the church, she could hear Russian voices shouting orders in the street below. They were coordinating a ground assault while their sniper kept her pinned down. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved to the opposite side of the bell tower, trying to find an escape route. The church was surrounded. The next hour became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Sarah used her knowledge of urban warfare to move through the building, changing positions constantly to avoid the enemy sniper's attempts to pin her down. She had limited ammunition and no backup, while the Russians continued to reinforce their positions around the church. Every movement had to be calculated perfectly. During a brief lull in the gunfire, Sarah heard voices speaking English in the street. A Ukrainian patrol had stumbled into the firefight. Not realizing they were walking into a trap, she watched through a crack in the wall as 8 Ukrainian soldiers advanced down the main street. Completely exposed to the Russian positions, they would be massacred in seconds. Sarah made a decision that violated every rule of sniper warfare. Instead of staying hidden and preserving her own life, she exposed herself at a window and began engaging the Russian positions. Her shots weren't aimed to kill, but to reveal enemy locations to the Ukrainian patrol below. "RPG team, 2nd floor of the blue building," she shouted in Ukrainian, hoping they could hear her over the gunfire. The gamble worked. The Ukrainian soldiers immediately took cover and began returning fire at the position Sarah had identified. But her actions had also revealed her location to every enemy fighter in the area. Bullets began raking the church from multiple directions as Russian soldiers coordinated their assault. Sarah retreated deeper into the building, fighting a running battle through corridors filled with religious artifacts and broken pews. She was down to her sidearm now, having expended most of her rifle ammunition in the initial engagement. Each room became a potential tomb as Russian soldiers methodically cleared the building. In the church basement, Sarah found a forgotten tunnel that connected to the adjacent cemetery. The passage was narrow and partially collapsed, but it offered her only hope of escape. She crawled through the darkness, listening to the sounds of the search continuing above her head. Russian voices echoed through the church as they searched for their elusive target. The tunnel emerged behind a large mausoleum in the cemetery. Sarah waited until nightfall before attempting to move, using the gravestones as cover while she worked her way toward friendly lines. The city around her was alive with enemy patrols searching for the sniper who had caused so much chaos earlier in the day. During her escape, Sarah encountered a wounded Ukrainian soldier hiding among the graves. He had been separated from his unit during the morning's fighting and was slowly bleeding to death from a leg wound. Despite the risk to herself, Sarah stopped to provide first aid and help him reach safety. The soldier, barely conscious, kept muttering in broken English, "You are the ghost? The one who saves people?" Sarah helped him to a Ukrainian checkpoint 3 blocks away, before disappearing back into the urban maze. The soldier would later tell his commanders about the mysterious sniper, who had risked her own life to save both him and the patrol that had walked into the ambush. Word of her actions spread through the Ukrainian ranks, adding to her growing reputation. Back at base the next morning, Captain Williams briefed Sarah on intelligence reports about Russian counter-sniper operations. "They're bringing in some of their best shooters specifically to hunt you down," he explained, spreading out reconnaissance photos on the table. "This man here is Viktor Petrov, formerly with Spetsnaz. He's credited with over 40 kills and has never failed to eliminate a target." Sarah studied the photograph of a stern-faced man in his 40s, noting the professional way he held his rifle and the confident set of his shoulders. This would be a different kind of enemy than the regular soldiers she had been fighting. Petrov was a professional killer with years of experience and a specific mission: find and eliminate the American sniper known as the Ghost. "They're also putting bounties on your head," Williams continued. $50,000 American dollars for anyone who can provide information leading to your capture or elimination. You've become quite the celebrity in enemy intelligence circles. Sarah nodded grimly, understanding that the war had just become much more personal. That night, as she prepared her equipment for the next day's mission, Sarah reflected on how the conflict was changing her. Each engagement required split-second decisions about life and death, not just for enemies but for the innocent people caught in the crossfire. She had saved lives by revealing her position, but she had also made herself a target for every Russian sniper in the theater. The face-to-face war with Viktor Petrov was about to begin, and Sarah knew that only one of them would walk away from their inevitable confrontation. The duel began 3 days later in the ruins of what had once been the city's financial district. Sarah had positioned herself in a partially collapsed office building, using the concrete and steel skeleton as both concealment and protection. Intelligence reports indicated that Viktor Petrov was operating in the same sector, likely setting up his own hunting ground among the urban debris. Sarah spent hours studying the surrounding buildings through her scope, looking for any sign of the Russian sniper. Petrov was too experienced to reveal himself carelessly, but even the best shooters left traces for those who knew how to read them. A flash of reflected sunlight, a barely perceptible movement, the flight pattern of disturbed birds, all could indicate an enemy position. On the second day of their deadly game, Sarah spotted movement in a window 700 meters away. Through her scope, she could see the outline of a rifle barrel extending from a shattered window in an apartment complex. The position offered excellent oversight of the main thoroughfare, exactly where a professional sniper would set up shop. But something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too perfectly placed for someone of Petrov's reputation. Sarah held her fire and continued observing. Her instincts were rewarded when she noticed a second position in a building 2 blocks away. This one was much better concealed, visible only as the faintest shadow in a doorway. The obvious rifle in the apartment window was a decoy, designed to draw her attention while Petrov positioned himself for a killing shot from an unexpected angle. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical danger. Each sniper was trying to get inside the other's head, to predict their opponent's next move. Sarah found herself second-guessing every decision, wondering if Petrov was anticipating her actions. She changed positions 3 times in 2 hours, never staying in one spot long enough for him to triangulate her location. The first direct exchange came when Sarah spotted muzzle flash from Petrov's position. His bullet struck the concrete near her head, sending fragments of stone across her face. She immediately returned fire, her shot passing through the window where she had seen the flash. But when she looked through her scope, there was no sign that she had hit her target. Petrov had fired and moved exactly as she would have done. Over the next several days, the 2 snipers engaged in a deadly ballet across the ruined city. They moved constantly, setting traps for each other, using the urban environment to their advantage. Sarah began to develop a grudging respect for her opponent's skills. Petrov was everything the intelligence reports had claimed: professional, experienced, and absolutely ruthless. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that Petrov was using the city's sewer system to move between positions undetected. She had noticed that his shots came from locations that should have been impossible to reach, without exposing himself to her observation. By studying the city's infrastructure maps, she identified the maintenance tunnels that would allow someone to move underground. Sarah spent an entire night repositioning herself to cover the sewer access points in Petrov's operational area. Her patience was rewarded just after dawn, when she saw a manhole cover move slightly in an alley 6 blocks away. Through her scope, she watched as Petrov emerged and moved quickly toward a new sniper hide. This was her chance. The shot was extremely difficult, requiring her to lead a moving target across uneven terrain while accounting for wind and distance. Sarah controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger just as Petrov reached the entrance to his chosen building. Her bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his rifle. But Petrov was far from finished. Despite his wound, he managed to reach cover inside the building. Sarah knew she had only moments before he would be ready to engage her again, possibly from a position she hadn't anticipated. She grabbed her gear and began moving toward his location, hoping to finish the engagement before he could recover. The hunt moved into the building itself, a damaged office complex with multiple floors and countless hiding spots. Sarah entered through a side entrance, her rifle ready as she moved through corridors filled with debris and abandoned office furniture. Every shadow could conceal her opponent. Every corner could be a killing ground. She found drops of blood on the stairwell leading to the 3rd floor. Petrov was wounded but still mobile, and he knew this building better than she did. Sarah moved carefully upward, using her training in close-quarters combat to clear each room systematically. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of artillery fire from other parts of the city. On the 4th floor, Sarah found Petrov's sniper hide, a carefully constructed position with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes. but it was empty except for expended shell casings and a small pool of blood. She studied the position, noting the professional way it had been set up. Petrov had been operating from here for days, watching and waiting for the perfect shot at his American opponent. A sound from the floor above made Sarah freeze. Petrov was still in the building, still hunting her even with a shoulder wound that would have incapacitated a less experienced soldier. She realized that he was trying to get above her, to gain the high ground advantage that would allow him to end their duel on his terms. Sarah moved toward the stairwell, but stopped when she noticed tripwires stretched across the steps. Petrov had booby-trapped his escape route, turning her pursuit into a deadly obstacle course. She carefully disarmed the first explosive device, a grenade rigged to detonate when the wire was disturbed. There were at least 3 more traps between her and the upper floors. The building shook as an artillery shell exploded nearby, reminding Sarah that their personal battle was taking place in the middle of a larger war. She could hear vehicles moving in the street below, and voices shouting orders in both Ukrainian and Russian. The front lines were shifting again, and soon this entire area would be overrun by ground troops. As Sarah worked to clear the remaining booby traps, she heard the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching from the east. Through a shattered window, she could see a Russian Mi-24 gunship circling the area. Petrov must have called for extraction, realizing that his wound was too severe to continue the engagement effectively. Sarah reached the roof just as the helicopter began its descent toward the building's flat top. Through her scope, she could see Petrov moving toward the landing zone, his left arm hanging useless at his side but his right still gripping a pistol. This would be her last chance to end their duel before he escaped. The range was less than 50 meters, almost impossible to miss even with a wounded target. But as Sarah lined up her shot, she found herself hesitating. Petrov had fought with honor, using skill rather than terrorism, targeting military personnel rather than civilians. In another time and place, they might have been colleagues rather than enemies. The moment of hesitation cost her the shot. Petrov reached the helicopter and was pulled aboard by the crew. As the aircraft lifted off, he looked back toward Sarah's position and raised his good hand in what might have been a salute or a promise of future encounter. The Ghost had won this round, but both snipers knew their war was far from over. 3 weeks after Petrov's evacuation, Sarah received orders for her most dangerous mission yet. Intelligence had identified a Russian command bunker hidden in the mountains 40 kilometers behind enemy lines. The facility coordinated artillery strikes across the entire southern front, and its elimination could save hundreds of Ukrainian lives. The problem was getting close enough to make the shot while avoiding the extensive security measures protecting the site. Sarah studied the reconnaissance photos in the pre-mission briefing. The bunker was built into the side of a mountain, with multiple layers of defense including automated sentry guns, patrol teams, and overlapping radar coverage. The only approach that offered a clear shot was from a ridge nearly 2 kilometers away, a distance that pushed the absolute limits of her rifle's effective range. "This is a one-way mission," Captain Williams said bluntly. "We can get you in, but extraction will be nearly impossible. The Russians will know exactly where the shot came from, and they'll have every available unit converging on your position within minutes." "Are you sure about this, Martinez?" Sarah looked at the satellite images of the Ukrainian positions being hammered by artillery, directed from this very bunker. Children's hospitals, refugee centers, civilian apartment buildings, all had been targeted with precision that could only come from this command center. "I'm sure, sir. When do I leave?" The insertion took place during a massive thunderstorm that provided cover from both visual observation and radar detection. Sarah parachuted into the mountains alone, carrying only her rifle, basic survival gear, and enough ammunition for a handful of shots. The weather was brutal, freezing rain and wind that made every step treacherous on the rocky terrain. It took Sarah 18 hours to reach her firing position, moving only at night and hiding during daylight to avoid patrol aircraft. The ridge she had chosen offered a perfect view of the bunker entrance, but it was completely exposed to the elements. She would have to remain motionless for hours in sub-freezing temperatures while waiting for her target to appear. Through her scope, Sarah could see Russian soldiers moving in and out of the bunker entrance. The facility was much larger than the intelligence photos had suggested, with multiple levels carved deep into the mountain. Her target was General Arkady Volkov, the artillery coordinator whose death would disrupt the entire fire support. network for this sector of the front. Sarah had been in position for 6 hours when she finally saw movement at the bunker entrance that matched her target profile. A group of high-ranking officers emerged for what appeared to be an inspection of the external defenses. Through her scope, she identified Volkov by the distinctive scarring on the left side of his face, a souvenir from his service in Chechnya. The shot would require every skill she had learned over years of training and combat. At nearly 2 kilometers, she would have to account for wind drift, bullet drop, temperature effects, and even the rotation of the Earth. The margin for error was essentially zero. A miss by mere inches would alert the entire facility to her presence. Without achieving the mission objective, Sarah controlled her breathing and began her pre-shot routine. The world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and that distant figure in her crosshairs. Wind readings, range calculations, ammunition temperature. Every variable had to be perfect. Through her scope, she watched Volkov gesture toward something outside her field of view, apparently discussing defensive improvements with his subordinates. The shot was the longest Sarah had ever attempted in combat. She squeezed the trigger and felt the rifle kick against her shoulder. For what seemed like an eternity, she watched through the scope as the bullet traveled across the mountain valley. Then she saw Volkov suddenly collapse, his bodyguards immediately rushing to his position. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. Within minutes, the mountainside erupted with activity, as Russian forces began searching for the sniper who had just eliminated one of their most important commanders. Attack helicopters appeared on the horizon, moving in a search pattern that would inevitably lead them to her position. Sarah began her escape, moving down the backside of the ridge as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow. Behind her, she could hear the sound of boots on stone as Russian Special Forces teams began climbing toward her former position. They were well-trained and highly motivated. The death of General Volkov had made this personal for them. The pursuit continued for 3 days across some of the most hostile terrain in Europe. Sarah used every trick she had learned in survival training, moving through streams to mask her scent from tracking dogs, using rock formations to break up her heat signature from thermal imaging, and traveling only during weather conditions that limited air surveillance. On the second night, exhausted and running low on supplies, Sarah was forced to take shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut. She had been moving for 36 hours straight and was approaching the limits of human endurance. As she rested fitfully in the crude shelter, she heard the sound of approaching vehicles on the mountain road below. Through a crack in the stone wall, Sarah watched as a convoy of Russian military vehicles stopped near the hut. Soldiers began spreading out to search the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved methodically up the mountainside. She was trapped with nowhere to run. Sarah prepared for a final stand, checking her sidearm and the 2 remaining rounds for her rifle. She would sell her life dearly, but the odds were overwhelming. As the search teams drew closer to her hiding place, she found herself thinking about her grandfather's words about steady hands and calm minds. Even in the face of certain death, she would maintain her composure. The first Russian soldier reached the hut just as the storm that had been building all day finally broke. Thunder crashed across the mountains as lightning illuminated the search teams advancing through the rain. The soldier called out in Russian for anyone inside to surrender, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Sarah remained motionless in the shadows as the soldier's flashlight beam swept through the interior of the hut. For a heart-stopping moment, the light passed directly over her position without revealing her presence. The soldier moved on, apparently satisfied that the structure was empty, but Sarah's relief was premature. A second soldier, more thorough than the first, entered the hut and began a systematic search. His light found the small depression in the dirt floor where Sarah had been lying, and he immediately called out to his companions. Within seconds, the hut was surrounded. "American sniper," a voice called out in accented English. "We know you are in there. Surrender now and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Sarah recognized the voice. It belonged to Colonel Dmitry Kozlov, a Spetsnaz commander she had studied during her intelligence briefings. If he was personally leading the search, it meant the Russians considered her capture a very high priority. Sarah remained silent, her finger on the trigger of her rifle. She had 2 shots left and at least a dozen enemies surrounding her position. The mathematics of the situation were clear, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. Through a gap in the stone wall, she could see soldiers positioning themselves for an assault on the hut. "You have fought with honor," Kozlov continued. his voice carrying clearly despite the storm. General Volkov was a worthy opponent's target. But this ends now. Come out, and live to fight another day in a prisoner exchange. Sarah considered her options. Surrender meant interrogation, propaganda value for the enemy, and possible execution despite promises of Geneva Convention treatment. Fighting meant certain death, but also the preservation of whatever intelligence she carried about American operations. As she weighed these grim alternatives, she heard something that changed everything: the distant sound of rotor blades cutting through the storm. The Russian soldiers heard it too, their voices rising in alarm as they tried to identify the approaching aircraft. Through the storm came the distinctive whop-whop-whop of American Black Hawk helicopters, flying low and fast through the mountain passes. Sarah's extraction team had found her despite impossible odds. The night exploded into chaos as the rescue helicopters engaged the Russian ground forces. Machine gun fire lit up the mountainside while soldiers on both sides scrambled for cover. Sarah used the confusion to break out of the hut, moving toward a clearing where the helicopters could land. A Russian soldier spotted her movement and opened fire, his bullets chipping stone from the rocks around her. Sarah spun and put her penultimate round center mass, dropping him before he could raise an alarm. She was down to one bullet and still 300 meters from the extraction point. The lead helicopter touched down in a swirl of rotor wash and flying debris as Sarah sprinted across the open ground. Russian forces were converging on the landing zone from 3 directions, their muzzle flashes visible through the rain and darkness. The helicopter crew laid down suppressive fire while Sarah covered the final 50 meters to safety. As hands pulled her aboard the aircraft, Sarah caught a glimpse of Colonel Kozlov directing his men's pursuit from behind a boulder outcropping. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the battlefield, and she saw something like respect in his gaze before the helicopter lifted off into the storm. The flight back to friendly territory took 2 hours through some of the most dangerous airspace in Europe. Russian surface-to-air missiles tracked their progress, but the storm that had nearly trapped Sarah now provided cover for her escape. She slumped in the helicopter's jump seat, exhaustion finally catching up with her as the adrenaline wore off. "Hell of a shot," the crew chief shouted over the engine noise, having been briefed on her mission. Volkov's death has already started disrupting their artillery coordination. Ukrainian positions that were getting hammered yesterday are reporting minimal incoming fire today. Sarah nodded, too tired to speak but satisfied that her nearly impossible mission had achieved its objective. Back at base 12 hours later, Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being debriefed by a general she had never met. Major General Patricia Hayes had flown in from NATO headquarters specifically to hear Sarah's first-hand account of the mission and her observations about Russian capabilities. "Sergeant Martinez," General Hayes began, "what you accomplished out there goes beyond impressive. It's unprecedented. A 2-kilometer shot in combat conditions, followed by a 3-day evasion through hostile territory. That's the kind of operation that becomes legend." She paused, studying Sarah's tired face. "But I need to know, how much more can you take? You've been in continuous combat for 4 months. Most snipers burn out after half that time." Sarah considered the question seriously. The physical exhaustion was manageable. She had trained for that. The psychological pressure was more challenging. Every day brought life or death decisions, moments when a split-second hesitation could mean failure. But she also knew that her skills were saving lives, disrupting enemy operations, and contributing to the broader war effort. "I can keep going, General," Sarah replied. "As long as there are targets that need engaging and lives that need saving, I'm ready." General Hayes nodded, apparently expecting that answer but needing to hear it directly. "Good, because we have intelligence about a new threat. The Russians are bringing in their absolute best counter-sniper specialist, someone even more dangerous than Petrov." She slid a classified folder across the table. "His name is Major Alexei Khrushchev, and he's never failed to eliminate a target. Never. He's being sent here specifically to hunt you down." Sarah opened the folder and studied the photograph of a man in his early 30s with cold, calculating eyes. His service record was extensive: Spetsnaz, special operations, advanced sniper training, and a list of confirmed kills that made even experienced soldiers uncomfortable. This wouldn't be another honorable duel like her encounter with Petrov. Khrushchev was a killer who used any method necessary to complete his missions. "When does he arrive?" Sarah asked, already beginning to plan her countermeasures. General Hayes checked her watch and smiled grimly. Intelligence suggests he's already here. The game has changed, Sergeant. Up until now, you've been the hunter. Now you're about to become the hunted. Major Alexei Khrushchev arrived in the war zone with a reputation that preceded him like a dark shadow. Unlike the professional Petrov, Khrushchev was known for psychological warfare, using terror tactics and civilian casualties to flush out his targets. His first message to Sarah came in the form of a Ukrainian sniper found dead in no man's land, positioned to look like he was still alive until someone got close enough to see the truth. Sarah studied the crime scene photographs with growing anger. The dead soldier had been arranged as bait, positioned to draw her into a killing zone where Khrushchev waited. But there was something else, a note pinned to the body in English. Ghost, you hide behind others. Face me alone, or watch them die one by one. The message was clear. Khrushchev would target anyone associated with her until she agreed to a direct confrontation. Captain Williams wanted to pull Sarah from active duty, but she refused. He's escalating because his psychological profile says I'll respond emotionally to threats against innocents, she explained, studying intelligence reports about Khrushchev's previous operations. If I hide, he'll keep killing until I come out. The only way to stop this is to end it. Sarah began preparing for what she knew would be her most dangerous encounter. Khrushchev wasn't just a sniper. He was a complete predator who used every advantage available. He had studied her tactics, knew her preferred positions, and understood her moral code well enough to exploit it. This wouldn't be a duel between professionals, but a hunt where only one participant would survive. The first direct engagement came 3 days later, when Sarah was providing overwatch for a humanitarian convoy delivering medical supplies to a refugee camp. Through her scope, she spotted movement in a building that overlooked the convoy route. The signature was subtle, just a brief flash of reflected light that could have been anything. But Sarah's instincts screamed danger. She was still acquiring the target when muzzle flash erupted from the window. Khrushchev's bullet passed so close to her head that she felt the pressure wave. His position had been perfectly calculated to catch her during her most vulnerable moment, when she was focused on protecting others rather than herself. Sarah immediately rolled to a new position as more shots chipped concrete around her previous location. The convoy below had scattered for cover, but Sarah could see that one of the medical trucks had been disabled by Khrushchev's fire. Wounded civilians were trapped in the open, while 2 snipers engaged in a deadly duel overhead. Sarah found herself fighting on 2 levels, trying to eliminate Khrushchev while also providing protection for the innocents caught in their crossfire. Khrushchev was using the civilians as psychological leverage, firing near them to force Sarah into hasty shots. Each time she tried to line up a careful shot, he would put rounds close enough to the refugees to make her rush her aim. It was a masterful display of combat psychology, turning Sarah's protective instincts against her tactical judgment. The engagement lasted 20 minutes before Khrushchev withdrew, vanishing into the urban maze as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah had managed to keep the casualties to a minimum, but she hadn't been able to eliminate her opponent. Worse, she realized that he had been studying her responses, learning her patterns for future encounters. That night, Sarah found a disturbing message waiting in her quarters. Someone had bypassed base security to leave a photograph on her cot, a picture of her family's house in Texas, taken recently enough to show her mother's new garden. The implication was clear. Khrushchev had assets everywhere, and no one Sarah cared about was safe. The psychological warfare escalated over the following week. Sarah would find evidence of Khrushchev's presence everywhere, spent shell casings placed where she would discover them, personal items moved in her quarters, even her rifle's zero mysteriously adjusted between missions. He was demonstrating that he could reach her anywhere, anytime, undermining her sense of security and trying to erode her mental composure. Sarah knew she was being manipulated, but knowing didn't make the tactics less effective. Sleep became difficult when every shadow could conceal a threat. Her shooting began to suffer as second-guessing crept into her decision-making process. Khrushchev was systematically dismantling her psychological defenses while avoiding direct confrontation. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered that Khrushchev had captured and executed her former spotter Chen, who had been reassigned to another unit. The body was found with evidence that Chen had been tortured for information about Sarah's tactics and preferences. Khrushchev was literally dissecting her operational methods by targeting anyone who had worked with her. Sarah realized that the conventional approach wasn't working. Khrushchev was too smart, too experienced, and too willing to break the rules of engagement that governed professional snipers. If she was going to stop him, she would have to abandon her own rulebook and fight him on his terms. She began her own psychological campaign, using Khrushchev's reputation against him. Sarah started spreading disinformation through intelligence channels, creating false reports about her activities and capabilities. She wanted Khrushchev to believe she was more vulnerable than she actually was, drawing him into a trap of his own making. The final confrontation was arranged through a series of calculated moves that took place over 3 days. Sarah deliberately exposed herself during a reconnaissance mission, allowing Khrushchev to track her to what appeared to be a perfect ambush site in an abandoned factory complex. But the trap was reversed. Sarah had spent days preparing the location, turning it into a killing ground designed specifically for her opponent. Khrushchev arrived with a small team of Spetsnaz operators, believing he was cornering an isolated American sniper. Instead, he found himself in a carefully orchestrated battle against an opponent who had studied his psychology as thoroughly as he had studied hers. Sarah had positioned explosive devices, created multiple firing positions, and established escape routes that Khrushchev couldn't anticipate. The battle lasted 4 hours and consumed most of the factory complex. Sarah systematically eliminated Khrushchev's support team while avoiding his attempts to pin her down. She used his own tactics against him, exploiting his psychological profile to predict his movements. When Khrushchev realized he was being hunted rather than hunting, his legendary composure finally cracked. The end came in the factory's main assembly hall, where Sarah had prepared her final position. Khrushchev, wounded and desperate, made a last attempt to eliminate his target through sheer aggression. But Sarah was ready for him, having anticipated this exact scenario. Her final shot ended the threat that had terrorized both military personnel and civilians for months. In the aftermath, Sarah found intelligence documents in Khrushchev's equipment that revealed the extent of his psychological warfare campaign. He had been building a complete profile of her personality, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. But his fatal mistake had been assuming that her moral code made her predictable. Sarah had learned to use her principles as strengths rather than vulnerabilities. 3 days later, Sarah stood in a field hospital where some of Khrushchev's victims were recovering. A young Ukrainian soldier, barely 18 years old, approached her with a translator. Through broken English and gestures, he told her that enemy soldiers in his sector had been talking about the American sniper who couldn't be defeated. They called her the one we were warned about, he explained, his eyes wide with respect and admiration. Sarah realized that her reputation had become something larger than her individual actions. To the Ukrainian forces, she represented hope and protection. To the enemy, she had become a symbol of unstoppable determination. The doubts and whispers from her training days seemed like ancient history now. She had proven herself in the most decisive arena possible, not just as a skilled shooter, but as a warrior who protected the innocent while defeating those who preyed upon the helpless. As Sarah cleaned her rifle that evening, preparing for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From the questioning looks on a Georgia training ground to the respect of battle-hardened soldiers on the front lines of a real war, she had traveled a path that few could imagine. The girl who had learned to shoot in her grandfather's fields had become a legend whispered about in enemy trenches. But Sarah knew that legends were just stories people told to make sense of extraordinary circumstances. The reality was simpler and more profound. When the moment came to stand between innocence and evil, she had chosen to stand. Everything else was just the sound of bullets finding their marks.